today we're talking about something very technical, so you guys will lead the conversation, but GraphQL, RESTful API versus selection objects. So does somebody want to start with GraphQL and then what this whole conversation is about?
Sure. You want to take a stab at
it? Sure. All right. I'm probably strangely for a web developer less familiar with the REST API norms, but as far as I understand, it's more about it's more based on divvying up your resources, I think they call it, through different endpoints, whereas the GraphQL approach is more about providing a one sort of endpoint that you can reuse to filter through your data in different ways, and with the emphasis being on being able to really finely grainedly tell it exactly what you want in your response. So rather than getting if you're looking at grabbing contact data, but you only need the first name and last name and you don't care about the address or something like that, you can just tell it, I want the first name and last name and I don't care about the address, and you get that information back, and it's going to ship across the internet slightly faster because there's less data there, and you have less, you don't have to jump in on the back end and write a new query and write more code to filter through the data before you ship it out, because it's part of that spec is that it does all of that for you already. So it seems like it's starting to be the new norm, at least in the web industry. And I think for good reason. We've been doing it for maybe 3 or 4 years. Is that right? Something like that.
Sounds about right.
It drastically cut down on time we've had to spend writing back-end code, writing front-end code. It's pretty darn easy to communicate to new developers how to use it. And when you need to make changes quickly, it's pretty straightforward to do that. You don't need a full stack developer to adjust queries. Yeah.
So it seems like this is a solution that you all have, you said, used for about 3 or 4 years. This is probably a question for Ricky. How would you have had to address the things that Zach's talking about before you all started using GraphQL, just for a little historical perspective?
Yeah, I guess it's just really just the next generation, the next evolution of solving the same problem. This problem being, how does the browser talk to, your server? How does it do that in a standard way? And restful thinking was, at the time it was the one of the biggest, best fleshed out ideas to solve this problem. But I think, one of the big issues that it had is that people really viewed it as a standard, and it's really more of a philosophy. It's a set of guidelines that an API, as a programmer, that you should stick to. And when you do, you become RESTful. You meet that specification. But it really became more of a philosophy, which means, as people started adopting it, and they adopted it as a philosophy and not a specification, they would implement it in slightly different ways. And so you get, the problem is that everyone's implementation is different. And so even though people claim to be RESTful, you still have to go and learn their API surface. And so that was really, us adopting that selection object style GraphQL style querying doesn't really solve that problem when you're dealing with a lot of third-party APIs, but it does solve it when you have developers working on your backend API and developing different functions on your backend independently of each other, because at the top level of that API, it's all standardized. You end up with a standard API surface, which is very nice. So we kind of attempted to solve the problem. And I mean, I guess you can do that with REST API, but even when you've got a lot of developers internally that are working on your back end, even their implementations of that API service might be slightly different. It's just not, there's a lot of things in that API specification that you just don't care about either, like headers. What a status, there's a lot of extra data that gets transmitted. Zach kind of mentioned that too. Things like status codes, which again are, for the most part, there are some key status codes that are well known. People have seen 404s for a long time. People kind of know what that means. But there are, when you're developing an API, people tend to just kind of make up their own status codes. They mean different things to different developers, and it's chaos, honestly. And who really cares about what the status code is?
So one question that I have is, obviously we have adopted this philosophy. Does this work? And you both touched on each of this a little bit, but why does it work well for our team? And then what other types of development teams would this work well for?
Team, I think, is we tend to do most of the work in-house. And because the selection object approach is kind of one of those solve it once problems or solutions rather, it allows us to, when we're working on the API, like it seems like the REST, if you're going RESTful, then you've got this to maintain, and you need to make sure that you've got all your endpoints up, and if you can kind of work on making this more efficient and this more efficient and this more efficient. But with this approach, it allows us to work on our API in kind of this way. We just go deep, and we have this kind of singular set of endpoints that we can use for to do a whole lot. And when we work on that code underneath that, it applies globally. So when we're making efficiency improvements or to speed up the API, it's never specific to a certain query. It's improves it everywhere, and that's kind of how we approach, I think, all of our work. So if you're a team like that, where you're really focused on trying to consolidate down problems into really kind of core, deep problems, it feels like a good fit.
So as you're talking, a lot of things make more sense to me, not being on the development team, but just our philosophy as a team in general. We tend to be very efficient and organized. Our team is all internal and all in the US. So the things you're saying, why it works well for us, makes sense to me. Would you say that it wouldn't work well for, let's say, a team that's not necessarily internal, or you're using sort of like an external development team to help develop some of your code?
I think there's trade-offs, at least right now. But I think those trade-offs actually get solved just over time as more tools get developed. So there's a lot of API tools that are built around RESTful thinking. So there's just a lot of industry knowledge about that. There's a lot of just, developers kind of come pre-configured with this understanding of RESTful APIs. You know what I mean? GraphQL is being taught more and more. by default. And so that's great. But it's just a time game at this point. So I think, I don't know, to me, the benefits are the long-term benefits of using a selection object API style system over RESTful API with a third-party, development team, I think outweigh the short-term just having to retrain them, because I think even the training cycle is very it's short. I mean, a big benefit as the kind of end user developer, when you're using a selection object API surface, you specify exactly what you want and you get back what you specified as far as the data is concerned. And so there's really no learning curve to it. You want this data, like Zach said, I want a contact object and I only want the first and last name. So here it is, just like you specified, right? That's what you get back. Traditionally, a RESTful API would require you to make that request to a specific API to get the contact data. You don't specify the data that you want, and you get back a list. You get back a list of the contacts, and then you got to loop over the list, or you get back a single contact, maybe if you just specified that, and but still it's the full contact object, right? And so in the worst case scenario, you got back a list of contacts and the list contained the entire contact object. Whereas if I wanted 100 contacts to print in a table with a selection object, I could just say, I just want the first and last name. And so the size of that request that has to go over the internet is so much smaller than a list of 100 contacts where I have their first and last name and their email and their phone and their address and all that stuff. So it's orders of magnitude different, right? So you've got a huge performance boost by going, to a selection object. And so I think those kinds of benefits just simply outweigh sticking to REST, even with third-party developers, even though it's a kind of industry standard still.
So it sounds like speed is part of this.
Yeah. Yeah. When we started applying the selection objects to some of those larger tables a few years ago, we saw like orders of magnitude speed increases, both in terms of like if you have a massive table and the browser's got to read and interpret it. So there was wins there, and I think the big one was what Ricky was saying is just the payload making its way across the internet.
So we've talked a little bit about past, current thinking and how you all use it. Do you have any thoughts about where the direction that this is going for development teams?
And I'm hoping it's becoming the standard. It is, I think people need to understand, though, it is still more of a philosophical thing. And so still there's going to be differences in, the implementations of these kinds of APIs. I think the nice thing is that they do standardize that top level surface. So the end user, the end developer that's using that API is presented with a standard API surface. But, it's still a philosophical thing, when you're actually implementing and building that API yourself. So I'm hoping it becomes standard, but I think as long as people understand that, and, it's, I don't know, things move so fast in our world, in the development world, so we'll see.
Yeah.
I know. Best solution out there right now, I guess, though, right?
Yeah. One of the complaints that I've read is that it allows like your front end devs to be more irresponsible with their queries because they don't have to think about joins. But come on, just don't be irresponsible. Just tell them how it works at a basic level, and then they'll understand that every time you try and request a child object, then it's a little more work.
So that's a thought that comes up. Ricky has said that this is a philosophical difference. How do we manage that with our front-end developers? do you guys have conversations about it? Do you just tell them exactly how it works?
Yeah, I mean, to some degree, most of our development team is full stack, and so they have access to the code that powers the API. And so I think everyone on the team has a pretty good understanding of how our API works, and which, to Zach's point, produces, I guess, results in them using it in the best case scenarios or the best ways, and not, in recursive loops and things like that that could cause performance problems. So.
Very cool. You guys have anything else you want to add?
Yeah, I guess we're not experts, right? So this is just our understanding of our own implementation of this and how it's worked out for us. I said our industry moves fast. We're part of the industry. We make changes. We'll probably make changes this week. Probably not massive sweeping changes, but we like to iterate quickly, and things change.
Yeah, I think each of us in our respective areas of expertise are consistently learning. So,
yeah. And we talked a lot, I think, about the efficiency of it in terms of moving data and querying data, but maybe even more so the efficiency gains that we've seen, I think, are based around just development time. Our devs really do very little work to grab data.
Good. So they can focus on other things.
Yeah.
Very cool.
Like the harder problems.
Yeah.
Lots of thinking time, as I understand it. Very cool. Well, thanks, guys.
Yeah, thank you. Talk soon.
Yeah, sounds good. Bye.